Campers of Reddit, what's the most disturbing thing you have saw while camping? A couple came to the spot next to ours after we had been camping for a few days. They were there for about 2 hours after unpacking and setting up camp, just practicing knife throwing and cracking a whip. One of them cut their finger off and the other came and asked if we could watch their campsite until they got back. We did. We also played Indiana Jones for about 3 hours drunk off our ass trying to swing from a broken branch of a tree with that whip. They never came back and we let the park ranger know to look after their stuff. Went to an empty campground in the mountains in California. The weather was bad, January of 16 or 17. We were set up near a small river cooking a late dinner in the dark after night fell. My old dog, a husky, starts absolutely losing his mind. He was screaming and barking at a place beyond our lantern light away towards the river. I flipped on my headlamp, and it was a mountain lion. It stared back at me for a second or two, then turned and I lost it in the brush, those eyes staring back at me. Bring your dog camping with you. Had something happened to me deep in the woods of Kentucky. Buddy and I were hiking to our campsite at night. It was pitch black beyond our lights. My friend then said he saw the reflective trail marker ahead. We both looked again, and it wasn't a trail marker, but two eyes spread far enough apart that I knew whatever housed them was huge. Then they did a quick bobbing move and disappeared. We both had knives in hand till we made it back. It probably tracked us long before we saw it. Made a fire and stayed up late talking and such to make noise. Maybe slept half an hour just after dawn. While hiking in Sweden I slept in a 3-sided shelter when suddenly at 11 p.m. some people came up to me asking me what I was doing etc. neighborhood watch, and telling me that there are strange people around. An hour or two after, I heard some more footsteps and an old man came close to the shelter, with no pants. Naked. Dong-ding-a-ling. Moon was bright. When he saw me sleeping there, he went away after a while. Went camping on the Mendocino coast of California in 80s/90s. The first night at the campground we hear what sounds like a woman screaming like she's being murdered. It terrified us all awake. After a sleepless night we learned that there was a peacock sanctuary nearby and that's how they sound. Oh yeah, peacocks sound absolutely brutal. We used to have a neighborhood peacock, tiny village in Germany. Nobody knew where it came from, probably from some nearby farm, but one day it just decided it lived in our street, where I lived as a kid with my parents. The neighbors called him Egon because his cries were so ugly he got an ugly name lol. But it was so cool having him around. In the spring, he would often spread out his colorful tail feathers and that was really beautiful. My parents had a whole vase with his colorful tail feathers, all fallen out naturally. He was fed by neighbors, but nobody ever retained him in any way and he stayed for years, blessing us with beautiful sights and ugly sounds lol. I got pretty good at imitating that cry as a kid. He once spooked my parents by repeatedly sliding down the roof onto the flat rooftop terrace next to it with a loud bang. Took days for my parents to figure it out. Unfortunately, one day a neighbor didn't see him behind her car tire. Man, I like that bird. Forever ago my friend and I were camping in a horse pasture, with the owner's permission, with my friend's horse. It near crushed me when it decided that he wanted to be in the tent too and see what we were doing. Reminds me of a couple years ago me and some buddies hiked out behind his mom's house and ate some mushrooms. After tripping all day and drinking a few beers, we were stumbling back to his house, and this horse came up to us pretty aggressively. None of us know enough about horses to read their body language, and we were too tired to run away, so we just sort of edged around it and made it out the other side of the field. When we got back to his house, his mom goes, "Oh, that's just old Floyd. He was just seeing if you had any beer or pot. That horse loves drinking beer and smoking pot." I was like 8 to 9 years old when I saw my grandpa standing bare naked by the river in the middle of the night when I had to go to pee, something that scared the crap out of me as I didn't see that it was him at first. He was apparently just taking a quick bath, something he usually does at nighttime when he's out camping, but the sight of him standing there still haunts me a little to this day. For some reason some people don't actually sit on the toilet seat in the campground vault toilets. Nothing is scarier than waking up at 3 a.m. half drunk half hungover when you are camping and walking to the bathroom to find someone hover shit all over the toilet seat and didn't even attempt to clean it up. As I was unpacking for a solo camping/quail hunt, two guys walked into my camp to chat. Dirty and very disheveled, Obviously drunk, they asked me if you got bullets for that gun? When they saw my shotgun case. After a few minutes they turned to walk back to their camp. I saw that one of them had his scalp peeled back, leaving an open and crusty wound the size of the palm of my hand. That night they drank and threw .22 rounds into the fire and ran. Eventually they passed out. The next day they were arrested, and I was told that the one with the scalp wound tried to attack someone with a roofing axe a couple of days earlier and got the Uno reverse card played, and they were up there hiding out. Gotta rewind like 25 years. The Blair Witch Project had recently come out. This is pre-internet for all intents and purposes, and the rumors were that it was real found footage. Silly to say today, I know. We woke up in the morning to find stones piled in front of our tent like in the movie. I'm sure it was just some kids from a neighboring camp, but it still freaked us out. Went to the forest with some friends one winter. We were completely unprepared and ended up sleeping bunched in a tiny tent in the snow. I woke up in the middle of the night hearing these grunting noises next to my head. I thought it was my friend snoring, but then realized there was this giant snout poking the fabric of the tent on the outside and literally breathing in my face. I barely held myself from screaming when the bear got bored of trying to get inside and left. We went outside in the morning and there were massive paw prints everywhere, plus the leftovers of our food were gone. Lesson learned the hard way. I was like 8 and I was camping with my dad plus uncles, and a bear tore open the neighboring space's tent smelling food. After a very panicked 30 seconds we all piled and slashed on my dad's pickup truck and chased it out of the area. The worst part was it started at our site and threw the beer cooler into the river, and I spent an hour harvesting river beers for the adults. On the drive home, my dad reminded me that since my mom stayed home, there was never any bears nearby at all. Lost with no service with my best friend in the Pike National Forest, Colorado, and managed to find a dispersed site campground, just dry lots in a loop you could pull up and claim, in the dead of night. Picked our dry lot, tramped a couple yards into the trees to set up our hammocks for the evening. After picking a hammock spot and slinging them up, we decided to take a little stroll around the loop to stretch and wind down before we turned in. In the center of the loop was an untamed grove of shrubbery and small trees. This night was so unnaturally dark we had to bust out the headlamps to get around safely. We prefer to walk around in the dark. As we are finishing up our last lap around the loop before we return to the car to finish settling in, I heard fainting rustling coming from the shrubbery and turned to look into it. As I do that, I make very intense eye contact with two very large, forward-facing eyeballs about 15 to 20 feet from our spot on the gravel drive. The longer I stared, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as details came into focus: rounded ears, apex eyes, very feline. It was a mountain lion. I vividly remember pointing at it and asking, "Rebecca, what is that? Are you also seeing that?" We immediately started panic giggling like two teenage girls, talking very loudly and backing away with linked hands. It never made a move towards us that we saw. I think it was just observing us. We abandoned everything that we had lugged out of the car already, hopped in and didn't leave for the rest of the night. We actually had a blast sleeping in the car, seats folded down into a mega bed with the windows cracked. Kind of wild to think that if we didn't go on our walk we would have just turned in for the night, all snug in our hammocks. Who knows what could have happened with a big cat that close. Packing up our gear in the morning had me so on edge, I psyched myself into thinking we were being stalked by the cat. My sons and I went camping in a very remote spot deep in the Idaho woods. We went for a 2-mile hike even deeper into the woods and came across a perfect circle about 5 feet in diameter made completely of bones, with a smaller circle of bones in the center of the circle with a deer skull placed directly in the middle. On the way back we looped around and found ourselves in front of a dense group of birch trees that gave off the darkest vibe. My sons and I all had goosebumps. We bypassed the birches and eventually made it back to camp. I think that 90% of the creepy, paranormal, supernatural stories you hear about the woods have rational explanations, including my story, but even though the ring of bones was odd, it's the dark ominous feeling that we all got from the birches that really unsettled me. A buddy of mine and I were paddling the Buffalo River in Arkansas. For reasons neither interesting nor relevant, we had to pull off and camp for the night next to a field in the middle of nowhere. In the middle of the night, we were awakened by ATVs not too far away. They got closer and closer until they were at our campsite. They started doing laps around our tent and yelling all kinds of things. It was exactly how you would imagine it would go in a movie right before the psycho rednecks do terrible things to the protagonists. Also, I'm from a redneck place where this was a completely plausible scenario, ending with me and my buddy bleeding at least a little, so we just laid there and hoped for the best, and fortunately they quickly got bored and left. My family had some land in a remote part of Colorado. We always had creepy nights up there where it felt like someone was watching us. My brother was up there once and heard footsteps around his tent and got so scared him and his fiancée left in the middle of the night. A few weeks later, 4 of us were up there and we found 4 rat tails nailed to the side of an old shed we had. We sold the land a few years ago. One time there were these campers across from us at another site and they were late 20s. They were drinking late into the night, which usually isn't a problem, Corps of Engineers Park, but this one fucker would make this loud scream every time he took a shot and he wouldn't stop doing it. At around 2 a.m. finally someone pulled up on a gator and told them all to shut up. This guy wasn't getting the hint and his friends were telling him loudly not to drink anymore or scream. It got quiet for about 10 minutes and then from inside my tent I saw headlights and heard a car pulling out. I figured someone was taking him home cause he was being annoying and ruining the fun for everyone. I'm finally starting to doze off and with my eyes closed I see a big blue flash and then a loud noise. There was a substation down the street and I'm pretty sure the guy drove himself into it or something close to it cause it was crazy bright and loud. I would say I feel sorry for the guy, but he was the most annoying person I had never met in my life. I probably heard him do his stupid ass Mario scream 15 times that night after 1 a.m. A friend of mine wild camped and found a nice spot. When the sun came up she found out that she was in someone's backyard and the family was sitting there eating breakfast and watching as she quietly packed up and left. Not my story, but my childhood friend wandered off with a buddy on a scout trip and found a corpse in the woods. Had a .22 caliber hole between its eyes. The two of them were 13-ish. He went to the trial, and had been advised that he might have to testify, since he discovered a murder victim. But they ended up not calling either of the kids. Back in the late 1980s I was camping with a friend off the Ortega Highway in Southern California. It was a lovely autumn afternoon. As we were getting ready to take a long walk, some more campers driving and, as people do, ignored a whole bunch of empty campsites to park right next to us. Their stereo went on immediately and loudly. We escaped the campground for our walk, and after a very nice time we started heading back. As we were walking along a fire road, we heard what sounded like someone sliding down a rock-strewn hill. We round the bend and see our new neighbors next to a pickup truck. They have long guns with them and as we got closer we realized the sound we heard was them shooting at the side of a hill in full auto, machine gun mode, if you will. They're not shooting at anything, and don't seem terribly menacing. We nod at them as we walk by. Flash forward to about 3 a.m. the next morning and the sound of Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon is echoing through the little valley where our campground is. Did I mention it was 3 a.m.? I liked Sa as much as the next aging hippie, but it was 3 a.m. I finally got up, left at the tent and walked into the neighboring space, approaching slowly. The automatic rifles were leaning against the picnic table and as I walked up one of the campers reached for one of the guns, but did not raise it menacingly. I smiled and asked if they could turn down their stereo. They didn't seem to be happy but they turned it down. Until I was just about back over to our tent, when they turned it up even louder. Not long before dawn I believe they treated us to some Leonard Skinnard. We left about 8 a.m. It's a pretty little campground, but I've never been back. Was at a campsite in rural Buffalo, New York, when a family of about 5 showed up and unpacked at the site next to us. Seemed like nice people, exchanged pleasantries, and went about our separate business setting up camp. The next morning, when we unzipped our tent and went to prep breakfast, we realized they were all still asleep, on the ground. No sleeping bag, no tent, just lying down, fully clothed, like they had been raptured. Remember, this is Buffalo, New York. Even in the summer, it gets cold at night. That was spooky. But we decided to leave them be and get packed up. Once we got back from a breakfast run, they were up and packing. Seeing that we were back, the father came over to us and introduced himself. Said we seemed like nice people, and that he wanted to warn us about the imminent collapse of the U.S. economy. He eyed our car and said that it'll be the only type of currency available once the banks shut down, and that we should be careful, since someone will want it more than our money when China invades. He pulled out his phone to try and show us a YouTube video that explains the whole thing, but we somehow extricated ourselves, and booked it, packed up and left faster than we ever have before. The disturbing thing was not just what he said, it was how calm and genial he was while saying it, as if he was talking about the weather. I went on a family camping trip in Austria as a kid. The campsite was in a forest, and my dad picked a nice spot between some trees. Unfortunately, our tent wouldn't fit, so we had to move along a bit. That night there was a massive storm, and I remember my parents tying the tent to the car and spending most of the night holding the tent down. In the morning we woke up and it was a bright sunny day. We opened the tent to find a 2-foot thick tree laying across the spot we originally picked. If our tent had fitted in that spot, we would have probably been killed. My mom cut the trip short at that point. Mountain lion tracks over our tracks. That was pretty spooky. Same area we camped next to this lake in July, and this rabbit came up and just hung out in our camp. We thought it was something terrifying sneaking up, bear or aforementioned mountain lion, until this cute little bunny just pops out of the underbrush. He hung out with at our camp for probably 3 hours or so before we went to bed finally. The spooky part of the bunny was, what is out there that this wild rabbit would rather stay super close to the humans? Kept my Glock on me for piss breaks. Not exactly something I saw but heard and felt. My dad and I went backpacking in the Yosemite National Park in California and stopped in a valley to camp for the night. In the middle of the night I woke up to the sound of at least a dozen, what sounded like deer, sprint right past our tent, followed by a loud thud behind our tent and the forest going dead silent. I've been camping my whole life and have never heard silence like that in a forest. Not even a leaf was blowing in the wind. Something instinctively inside me made my whole body freeze. I couldn't breathe, goosebumps, heart racing, literally petrified. As I laid there frozen, I swear on my life I could hear whatever made that loud thud start tiptoeing around our tent. I say tiptoeing because the steps were so soft and careful that it felt intentional, like it was investigating our tent, and I could feel its presence moving around the tent. After what felt like a lifetime but was probably only 5 to 10 minutes, a branch snapped somewhere in the forest, followed by a loud whoosh of wind, and the forest just went back to normal. I wanna say it was a mountain lion just curious about our tent or something, and that's what I told myself the rest of our trip so I could sleep at night. But the horrible pit in my stomach and fear that washed over me was nothing like I've ever felt before or since, and has me convinced there are things in the forest far worse than people realize. About 40 years ago I went camping with 2 friends to upstate NY. One friend said he knew a cool place for camping. It was already getting dark when we left and, as was common at the time, we drank the entire way there. We get to the park and we're pretty blasted. We grab our backpacks and our supply of beer and a bottle of Jack and start heading in. We were stumbling around, but we ended up hiking for about an hour. Finally we were deep into the woods and we find a nice clearing. We set up the tent as best we can, start a big fire and continue to drink. We got wasted. The next morning, I hear noises outside the tent. I stick my head out and there is a troop of Boy Scouts surrounding our camp, and several are raking dirt onto our fire, putting out the embers. One of the scouts looks at me and says, "There's no camping allowed here." I look around and there are tons of people walking by looking at our falling down tent, beer cans all over and other debris. We were in some day park, like where people come on weekends to hike and play with their kids. Worst thing was, I looked to the right and the parking lot and our car was right there, about 50 feet away. We thought we were deep in the woods. We packed our shit quick and took off. We went off for a grouse hunt during our camping trip. Things weren't going so well. We hadn't seen any signs of chickens, or of any animals for that matter. We didn't hear so much as a squirrel. The night before was different, however. We thought we could hear some kind of low cry, but had dismissed it and stoked up our fire. While we were looking for chickens, we came across a fresh bear cub carcass, chewed to shit, looked like a pretty rough death. This is a story about my grandma that I didn't hear directly from her, but from my family. My grandmother, born in the 20s, grew up in suburban Florida and didn't really have any experience with wildlife. After she married my grandfather, they went camping in Yellowstone, possibly their honeymoon. Not sure. They went for a hike and when they came back they saw a bear at the campground sniffing around the steaks my grandma was gonna prepare for dinner. My grandma ran up to the bear and smacked on the nose with the flat side of an axe, not recommended. Fortunately the bear ran off. Now, I have no idea how big this bear was, may have been a baby for all I know, but still makes for a good story. She was also a real-life Rosie the Riveter during World War II. My grandma was a badass. Fun story. Nothing terrible here, it was a bachelor party. We decided to go camping in North Florida. Well, somehow, it turned out to be the coldest time of the year. Well into the 40s and 30s. It was so hard to leave the campfire to go to bed because any time away from the fire was freezing. I lucked out to be on an air mattress, but other guys weren't so lucky. Day 2 and we're all hungover, making breakfast. I'm trying to take a nap in the car when I see snowflakes coming down the windshield. Yeah, snowflakes in Florida at like 8 a.m. Well, about an hour later, a van pulls into the campsite next to us. It immediately hits a stump and blows a tire. A family with 2 kids jump out and start to set up. About this time, we are looking at these 2 little girls and wondering how the heck they're going to make it through a night like we just had. This family looked pretty and prepared. Our suspicions were confirmed when the wife came over asking for a lighter and that her stupid husband forgot to pack anything that could make a fire. Oh man. Here we go. So fast forward to about midnight or 1 a.m. when I hear crying and a few minutes later the van running. I figure the family shoved the girls in the warm van. Makes sense, so I go back to sleep. Next morning, campsite abandoned and van/family gone. I think they just left all their stuff and went home or to a hotel after just like half a day of camping. Poor family. I camp yearly and each year our site gets a little better/more complex. We can wander around in heavy rain and stay dry with all our tarps and poles, block the wind or neighboring site's view. The first and last day is a bit of work, but it's quite a campsite. The second day a couple seemingly from the city and on their first campout took the site below ours. They had fancy rooms and a stereo that shook the trees, a pop-up tent never staked down and one of those air mattresses that are a couple feet thick. We watch the weather and prepare accordingly. This couple fought the whole time, so we didn't warn them about the rain coming and maybe a tarp was a good idea. When the rain began a little after midnight, it was a downpour and their campsite came alive. Yelling, bickering, and blaming the other. Within about 5 minutes the place they put their tent was full of water and seemed to be filling from the top as well. Everything was just shoved into the back of their rusty with fancy rims truck, and I can still see the guy kicking the barely deflated mattress into the back seat. I went to bed laughing. The next day was damp but peaceful, until the evening. A guy in a decent-looking pickup truck had taken the spot and also seemed to be new, things still wrapped from the factory. When we saw he was with what seemed to be his daughter and parents, we tried to offer some advice and share the story from the night before, pointing out low spots and obvious paths the water had taken, but this was a guy that knew everything already and he was rude. Checked the weather as we do and we got some extra firewood because we knew we'd get another show, but it didn't rain until around 8 a.m. Just in time for coffee. We turned our chairs and relaxed, clearly enjoying the free show of angry rushed repacking with our feet up drinking coffee. I'm not sure which one I enjoyed more. I felt bad for the little girl, but the grandparents seemed decent. Went on a heavy drinking camping trip in college, and at the end of the night it was just a friend and I up talking into the late night. She opened up to me about her dad's suicide, and off in the distance about 100 meters away I could faintly see a white glowing entity, almost like a person with a white sheet over themselves. I didn't mention it because I was sorta comforting her, and she commented that she saw the same thing I saw. I advised her that it is best we just ignore it and nothing happened. Wasn't so much that I saw so much as heard. My brother and I went camping up the mountain for a couple of nights. First night was awesome. Found a nice clearing where we could safely make a fire and camp out. Second night, started great, but as it got dark we heard a bear in the distance. There was a large clear-cut area that it was in, so we could hear it from quite a long ways away, so we weren't too concerned at the time. Then after the sun went down, we heard it much closer, enough that we could hear its footsteps in the woods. We were a little freaked out, so we tossed some rocks and yelled. Didn't seem to make a difference, it kept getting closer. Then we heard more of them, at least 3 coming from different directions, basically surrounding us. One got real close and growled in the darkness. We all know what a bear sounds like from movies, but in real life, it's much more guttural, primal. You can feel it in your chest, and it also had this train whistle-like overtone to it. It was the scariest sound I've ever heard in my life. We packed everything up like it was an Olympic sport and got out of there. Thankfully we had lots of light and a trail to follow. Because of the adrenaline, what took us 2 days to hike up, took us 3 hours to get back down. I remember constantly looking back to see if anything was following us. We found an RV campground near the base of the mountain and had to steal some water at 2 in the morning because we were so dehydrated by the time we got there. We probably could have just asked for some, but we were still in primal caveman running from predators mode. I understand the quick trip back. In '79 I was setting up rabbit snares in a remote area on a Sunday. You weren't allowed to use or carry a gun on Sunday back then, so I left my shotgun back at the cabin. It took me 3 hours to work up the mountain setting snares and enjoying the trail. It was an old corduroy road from logging operations in the '30s. I came around a bend and there was a black bear looking at me. I turned around and bolted back down the hill. I made it back to the truck in 5 minutes. I went back up there the next morning with my gun and the bear's print indicated he ran just as fast as me but in the opposite direction. We were camping in St. Regis, Montana and floating down the Clark Fork River. I was maybe 15 years old. We split the family in 2 rafts. Dad always misjudged the timing and a 5 hours float trip always turned into an 8 hours trip. We hit the water at 2 p.m. so by the last stretch, it was getting dark and cold. We all heard a woman asking for help. Not screaming but yelling, "Help me, please help me." I see a woman on the side of the river trying to reach the water with a guy behind her pushing her into the ground. Her shirt was ripped, she was chubby with olive skin, black hair. I remember she looked like my mom's age, about 40. Her hair was all jacked up on one side and there were twigs poking out. Us kids froze but my dad started frantic paddling towards us kids and threw a rope so we didn't float down the river without them, and then he got both rafts to the side of the river. By then we were so far upstream there was just nothing we could do. Couldn't walk up the bank as it was wild and overgrown. We couldn't see or hear anything anymore. We sat there for a few minutes before we got back in our rafts. Cell phones were not widespread yet, this is early '90s. Once at the campsite, my dad drove to town and reported what we saw. That was it. I think about that lady a few times a year. I was looking on free roam for a dispersed campsite near Eugene, Oregon last year during a road trip. There weren't a ton of options, but it was starting to get dark and I had been driving all day, so I went up a forest access road a couple miles to the one site that was closest, about 20 minutes. It was super thick forest, then out of nowhere a narrow driveway that opened up to a bushwhacked spot with a fire pit. There was a good amount of garbage and some shotgun shells lying around. That's not super out of the ordinary, but something just felt off. I opened up my door and let my chihuahuas jump out. They are usually pumped to run around and chase each other, but they both immediately stopped as soon as they hit the ground, stared into the bushes about 20 feet away, and growled. I thought maybe there was an animal back there, so I hooked them back into the truck and began setting up my rooftop tent. My stomach started gurgling and I realized I had to do my business. I grabbed my shovel and wipes and started looking for a spot to go down the road. The forest was so thick, there weren't any good openings, so I came back to the site and started walking the perimeter to find a hole to duck into. As things were becoming urgent, I found an opening, right where my dogs were staring and growling, and just out of sight into the brush was a mattress with dirty sheets and a perfectly intact milk carton. I got chills, and I could just feel that someone else was there, just out of sight. It was pretty dark at this point, but I quickly ran back to the road and dug my hole and did my thing, came back and started packing everything back up. There was no cell service, and for all I know there could be multiple people in the bushes waiting for me to go to sleep, and the shotgun shells. We just went into town and got a hotel. Intuition was screaming at me to not stay in that place. Arrived at a campsite around 3 p.m. in Val Verde, California area to camp one night with my boyfriend, who is a black man. And that is important detail for later, in 2012. Maybe one other family in the whole area, but felt just like us. We set up and were chilling until around 7 p.m. when like 10 pickup trucks arrive and maybe 30 people congregate. They are immediately loud and obnoxious and too close, but whatever. We only staying for one night, so whatever. The huge group start to stack big pile of wood to make a huge bonfire and we start to notice. They are all men. White men. Most of them are bald. Then one younger guy comes over to us and offers us a beer. How nice. He says, "Hey, sorry if we are loud, but here's a peace offering." Then just before he turns back to his group he says, "You and that N-word better get out of here before dark." It was an Aryan Brotherhood meetup. We got out of there so fast. Was with a group of about 8 people. We were in a very isolated location, not a formal campground. We always preferred to hike in and get as far away from other people as possible. Around 9 or 10 it was pitch black and the woods were silent. No wind. We were all pretty buzzed off whiskey at this point, and out of nowhere this dude with a hunting rifle on his back steps into the firelight. He wasn't wearing a shirt and basically looked homeless, kind of a blank stare on his face. Keep in mind, we were in the Rockies at like 10k feet, so it was not warm, and he wasn't wearing a shirt. The fact that we didn't hear him meant he had definitely snuck up on us. We went silent and just stared at him. He looked around, didn't say a word, and backed into the darkness. We slept in shifts that night and kept the fire blazing. We could hear him moving around our camp till sunrise, when I guess he gave up. We got out of there at first light and I reported it to Park Service. Me and a friend were hiking on the Appalachian Trail in Georgia back when we had just graduated high school. We were on the trail for 3 or 4 days backpacking. One night at one of the shelters, we met this older couple, probably 30s, 40s, camping at the same shelter for the night. Sun was going down, and we made a fire and started to talk to them. Their story made no sense. Long story short, they were hiking from Virginia down to Florida because their car broke down. Then they started telling us crazy stories about how they used to catch cats, decapitate them and put them on the hood of their car like an ornament. I immediately had a feeling that they were fugitives or predators PR something. Lucky me and my buddy could hold our own, and I made sure they caught a glimpse of my pistol after that shit. They were creeps. Also, one time was camping at Sand Rock in Alabama and heard a whole group/cult of at least 10 people chanting in one of the caves there in middle of night. Like speaking in tongues or some kind of gibberish. I've done a lot of camping all over the country, but those two memories stick out as being close calls for me. I was camping on a beach in Costa Rica. It was beautiful. The first night, I could hear something moving around my tent. I peeked around through the top as best I could. Couldn't see anything. The sound is non-stop. Something is right next to me, moving all around my tent. After like an hour, I need to know. Finally, I open the tent and look around. Thousands of crabs were heading back to the ocean and were falling of this little one wall. Laughed once I figured it out, but I was terrified. On a dab and a half of acid, came around a stand of trees and was confronted by an 1,100 pounds female grizzly and her 2 cubs. I stopped dead in my tracks, and contemplated if it was hallucination. Then slowly retreated. Campground manager confirmed next day that a female grizz was bedding down near campers because the males won't come near. We were camping for 4 days in an area of the Red Feather Lakes, and Colorado, for 4 days. Deep into the woods, 20 miles down a dirt road without anyone else in sight. We came in during the day and didn't notice anything unusual. We had enough supplies for maybe 6 days for our party, my wife and I, my brother-in-law, my 3 nephews ages 5, 6, 8 and our dogs. Day 1 was amazing. Hiking, fishing, stargazing and s'mores. Dogs loved roaming around. The next day was equally as amazing. Lots of activities. Yard games like cornhole and board games with the boys. Around 6 p.m. though the mood/atmosphere changed with the dogs. Suddenly they were seemingly very on edge. Patrolling the edge of our camp, hackles raised, occasionally growling at the woods. We didn't think a whole lot of it. We had hiked into the woods for miles and everything was just forest in every direction for miles and miles. There was a hill we could go up another, plus 700 feet. That we'd get above the tree line for stargazing and we could see in every direction. No other lights, campfires, etc. Figured the dogs were detecting wildlife, maybe a curious black bear or even a mountain lion. They're big dogs, were armed. We didn't let the kids wander too far from sight, but again it didn't seem like an issue. That night us adults stayed up around the campfire till 1 a.m. or so. I kept getting a feeling that something was watching us. I was more on edge than I've been, and we're avid campers with plenty of experiences/run-ins with bears and other wildlife while in the woods. It just felt different. When we finally went to bed, I don't think I slept more than half an hour at a time and swore I'd hear the occasional crack of branches off in the woods. The next day we didn't notice anything off about the camp, although my brother suspected something had happened to our water. We had 5 or 6 of those 5-gallon jugs with a little pull-out spigot on them. 2 were in my truck, 1 in our tent, 1 in his car, and the remaining 2 appeared drained, although it might have been the boys or a leak. We decided we might pack it in after lunch on day 3. We didn't want to end the trip early, but stuff just felt so strange. The boys were sad and we were back and forth on if we were being paranoid, but the dogs were just seemingly so on guard and were going crazy, running around sniffing like crazy when we went on our hike that day. After lunch we started packing up our gear. 2 tents, games, food, etc. Takes a while to pack up, especially with 3 little boys running around like crazy and weren't in a rush. By the time we were all loaded up we decided we'd heat up a quick dinner. The boys had one last request: they wanted to go snipe hunting. Still had an hour or so of daylight left, so we were fine with it. We went off into the forest and did the classic snipe hunt thing. Bill in the front leading us in a wide circle that'd end back at the camp, my wife in the middle of the boys, me trailing the rear. I'd pick up small rocks and sticks, and when the boys were looking away I'd toss a rock or stick and they jump all scared and the other 2 adults go, "Oh my gosh, I think the snipe went this way." It's good fun. Well, as the sun was going down a bit more, not dark but setting and we're nearing camp, a rock the size of 2 fists comes flying and barely kissing one of my nephews. The adults look back at me like I'm crazy and I'm like, that wasn't me. Another rock comes in and hits me square in the back. We don't even ask questions, time to go. Each adult grabs a kid and we book it back to our cars. The woods are moving behind us as we get to the cars. Bushes shaking, tree branches cracking and popping. We're all loaded up. I think, if we left anything behind, sorry to the Forest Service. We've got about 20 miles of dirt road back to concrete. We get maybe a quarter mile into our drive and suddenly the road is littered with bones and animal carcasses. Beheaded deer and raccoon bodies, some fresh, others just bones. We're driving left and right trying to avoid hitting any of the more recently dead animals. I know it's hard to believe, but it's like this for what feels like nearly a full mile. Just bones and torn up animals. We finally make it through and it's clear driving for another couple miles or so. We get to a clearing and I see a green bus pulled off in a clearing for another campsite. I, for some reason, decide I'm going to stop and see if anyone is there to tell them something is up. My brother keeps going down the road with my nephews, my wife stays in the car. I approach the green bus to see if anyone is around. As I get close to the bus I see the bus is super run down, flat tires, newspapers over the windows, peeling paint. There's a big fire pit dug out, maybe 20 by 20 feet, pretty deep too. Inside is just, like an immense pile of bones. I see moose antlers, femurs of all sizes, rib cages. It felt like 40 animals worth of bones. I'm glancing around and there's all sorts of little symbols on the bus and tied up in the trees with string, a few smaller hanging dead animals. I just booked it back to the truck and said nope to my wife and we goes down the road to catch up with my brother. Whole stop lasted maybe a minute, that's the end. I don't know if it was poachers, cultists, combo of the two. Maybe some sort of weird Wiccans or just some resourceful meth addicts or something. In the end, I'm glad we never found out. When I woke up next to my then girlfriend 30 years ago, we just looked at each other and didn't say anything. We both knew that at the end of that day we would never see each other again. She was moving home and so was I. We were young and in love, but it wasn't meant to be. We made love over and over again until it was time to go. We packed up, hiked out and said goodbye later that day. That was the last time I saw her. My boys and I were doing a primitive camping trip and the site happened to have a porta potty, which is a bonus. My boys had never used a porta potty or an outhouse before. After setting up camp, I walked them over to the porta potty and warned them that you have to look inside before you sit down and to lift up the lid and check before you sit down. In our area this is a common place for black widows, brown recluses, and snakes to hide. I lifted up the lid to show them and sure enough a snake was curled up underneath it. In a backcountry cabin there were thousands of flies that seemed to keep coming even after we were sure the windows were sealed. It was like they were coming out of the floor, no clear explanation, or why they even wanted to be there. We had a backyard fogger candle so we lit that to see if it would calm them down for swatting or shooing. Turns out in an enclosed area, this is lethal to flies. They all died, leaving dustbans full of fly corpses to literally sweep up and remove. Then there were no more flies around the cabin at all. Went camping as a kid up in the Appalachian Mountains somewhere in Virginia with family out there. In the middle of the night we heard a scream that woke us all up that sounded like a woman being murdered. I near peed myself. They told me it was some monster, which only scared me more. Years later I came across a video of a fox screaming and it was the exact same sound. Lots and lots of women's and girls' dresses carefully hung up in trees along about a kilometer of an old unkept side road along a trail system. Our dog was on her period, running around the campsite and marking everything. She attracted wolves to our campsite, so that was a fun night spent sleeping in the car. I had a moose wander right through the middle of my campsite and freeze about 6 feet from me when she finally noticed me sitting there. I spent a few tense moments thinking about whether or not I could dive under the camper before she got to me, and then she finally trotted off. I have a regular off-grid spot in my favorite mountain range. We took off to go to some hot springs and hiking. During our trip down the road we were waved down by a family looking for someone. We were told that the car parked at the beginning of the trail was their sons who traveled several states to come to the very spot we camp at. We came back after our day to search and rescue teams and police searching the area as the individual was missing for over a week. The police wouldn't let us go back to our site for several hours. Finally we were allowed to go back and cook dinner. The evening and night were very ominous with the bells jingling on search dogs' collars and people yelling the man's name. The next morning we woke up to a helicopter. The campsite is 50 yards away from a 500-foot cliff that overlooks the valley. Turns out the guy jumped. They found him at the bottom of the cliff. It was very sad watching the family mourn as we packed our gear up. Since that day I haven't camped there. Not a camper, but my family owned a campground for 10 years. We were privately owned and prideful. In other words, we didn't have enough money to pay people, so we did all the caretaking. July 5th my dad asked me to go clean bathhouses. I proceeded to take care of the front bathhouse, which was in surprisingly good shape for a party weekend. Nothing too out of the norm. I then proceeded to the back bathhouse. Upon opening the door to the men's side I was greeted with a smell I'll never forget. In front of me was a trail of diarrhea and vomit, leading from the stalls to the showers about 15 feet away. As my eyes tracked the trail I found a man, passed out and face down in the showers. He was covered head to toe in shit and chunky vomit. I legitimately thought he was dead and poked him in the leg with the broom I had. Thankfully he groaned and moved slightly. At 13 years old, I had the realization that my dad did not pay me enough to deal with this and proceeded to run to mommy, who then made my dad clean it up. I love to camp. Rarely ever do I camp where there are people. For obvious reasons. The last time in an actual campground was at a reservoir north of Phoenix. Had the place all to myself. A group of college girls showed up. And they all got so drunk. One of them, a cute brunette, dropped her phone in the outhouse toilet. She was absolutely wasted. And devastated by the loss of her phone. Wouldn't let anyone use the toilet. Bawling her eyes out, I felt so bad for her. I had a rake in my truck. I'm a prepared camper always. Being the only dead sober camper in sight, and a gentleman, I sacrificed my rake for her sanity. Fished her phone out of the toilet. And God knows what else, her phone still worked. She grabbed it. And immediately checked her social media. Gave me a big wet, sloppy drunk AF kiss and hug. I bid the obligatory "you're most welcome." And returned to my campsite. Sanitized my hands. Washed them. Sanitized them again. Threw my rake in the fire. Changed my clothes. Tossed my infected with whatever vermin lives in a Phoenix Oz outhouse clothes in the garbage. Went to bed. Plus side of their loud party keeping me awake? I heard all about how I was the hero for rescuing her phone. I smiled to myself, thinking, it was just a shitty phone. I miss Arizona sometimes. Stay safe, campers. I'm pretty sure I ran into a skinwalker. I'm from southern Utah area. I'm literally a 20-minute drive from the Arizona border, which is a hotspot for skinwalkers. When we got to my campsite, there was a deer carcass that was torn up and thrown all over the campsite. The head was split in half and each half was 20 feet away from the other half. Then the legs were all pretty far apart. Every part of its body had been picked clean except one leg, which still had all of its fur and flesh intact. This freaked me out because A, no animal in any southern Utah desert is big enough or strong enough to completely snap a skull in half like that, and B, the body was fresh enough that no bugs had even reached it, which meant this was likely an active hunting ground. My camping buddy didn't listen to me and we stayed the night without switching spots. Sometime after midnight, weird shit started happening. There were these weird animal sounds that I've never heard in my entire life. We googled all of the scariest animal noises the next morning and found nothing that sounded like this. It sounded like someone gasping for breath really sharply and for a long period of time. The sound traveled insanely fast. 1 second it was right next to our tent, the next it was 30 feet away. I was freaked out of my mind, and my dog was sat straight up and didn't budge. She was growling but didn't make any other noise. We dipped the second the sun was up and never went back to the spot again. I didn't believe in skinwalkers until that night. Watched an idiot stand over a fire pit and start pouring gasoline from a can into it. As their perfect stream of gas allowed flames to start climbing up the rope of former dinosaurs, they flung the can across the campsite. Now there's small fires all over the place. Fortunately, this campground was on the shores of Lake Michigan with sandy soil, as our group ran over and kicked dirt on top of all of the spots that were burning, shortly after we saw the rangers visiting these absolute morons. Camping with my grandparents and cousins. My grandma took all us kids to the lake. When we got back to the site, there is my grandpa sitting reading the paper, and behind him is a bear just sitting there. It saw us and got up and lumbered away. According to my grandpa, it had been there for at least 20 minutes. He said he felt something sniff the back of his head, and a quick shoulder check revealed the bear. He decided that if it was going to take him, there isn't anything he can do about, so he might as well keep reading. Me and my buddy had been camping over a long weekend. It was our last night, and I randomly, half drunk, jokingly asked what he'd do if we woke up tomorrow and our tent was covered in spiders. We woke up the next day and the tent was covered in spiders, so thick we had to brush them off by the armfuls. I'm not arachnophobic, and they were just daddy long legs, but most people hate to hear the story. I just think it was weird that I randomly joked about something that seemed so absurd, then woke up to it the next day. Kind of reverse answer. 16 years old, spent a week camping with my grands. We met up near Kings Island Amusement Park with my parents at the end of the week. I met some locals at the park, including a cute 16-year-old girl and her older sister. At the end of the day, talked my fam into letting me go with those two to get some pizza and check out a band their friend was in. Agreed to be back by 10 p.m. Hormones took control and ended up staying out at night. Rolled back into the campground at first light. The look of relief on my grandmother's face shook me to my core. Dad and Granddad had been out all night looking for me, fearing I had been in an accident/kidnapped/ or worse. I have never felt so low or so ungrateful in my life. Still think about 35 years later. Camping in one of the Carolinas in a remote site about 5 years ago. I was with a few other people. We all stayed in the same tent. Every night we would go out, hike, do what not, return, have a few drinks and hit the sack. Around 10:30 to 11 every night it was like a wall of 100 miles per hour winds hit the tent and blew it to the ground. Out of fear I grabbed my buddies and prepared for the worst, but after about a minute it stopped. This happened for 3 nights like a ritual. On the last night we tried to catch it and missed it. I still think of it to this day. It was otherworldly and could probably be explained, as I saw some things that couldn't explain it with air cooling and whatnot, but it was something else. It was not a person, I am sure of that almost 100%. First year of college I went camping with my roommate and one of her friend's family's property. We got there and set up camp. After a few hours being there we were going to eat dinner. Obviously they had me cook because I am a culinary student, even though all I did was just put hot dogs over a fire, and as I was roasting the dogs I heard a loud grunting sound and I looked up. Standing right there was probably the biggest bear I've ever seen. The damn bear just walked up to the campsite like it owned the place. When the girls came out of the tent they screamed so loud that the bear backed down due to the loud noise. After that little trip I've always remembered to bring a gun along with us. I wasn't camping, but the poor sod whose tent I found had been. I was on a walk in the woods when I saw a clearing that seemed to be full of white flowers. When I got closer, I realized they weren't flowers at all but torn up pages of Stephen King's The Shining. The scraps were all singed around the edges. At one side of the clearing was what remained of a tent. It had been ripped apart as though by a bear, with what looked like huge claw marks through the fabric. You might say animal attacks happen. Very sad but nothing extraordinary, but this happened just outside a village in the south of England. The biggest animal I've seen in the wild around here is a deer, and deer certainly can't do that. There's no animal in those woods capable of that. I was around 13 camping in my parents' back garden with friends. The garden is surrounded by hedges, but we must have been making a racket as I saw someone walking round the tent. I shit a brick and my mate got up on all fours to unfasten the zip when a fist smacked him in the side of the head, sending him flying. We got out and grabbed some garden tools, but whoever it was long gone. I've never figured out who it was, definitely not my dad, he wasn't that type. Was up on some logging roads deep in a forested mountain area of East Idaho. My friend and I find a secluded spot and start to unload when we both hear/feel like a large sonic or vibrational force that hit us both. Felt like it came from 30 yards inside the treat area. We both looked at each other, freaked out, quickly put everything in the car and drove off to camp miles away. No idea what it was, but we had the exact same experience and reaction. Noped right on out of there. I got out of my tent in the middle of the night to smoke weed on a Boy Scout camping trip, and when I came back, I saw 2 bear cubs messing with our crew gear on the picnic tables, which probably had some food scraps. It scared the shit out of me, not only because I was freshly high, but seeing bear cubs usually means a mama bear is nearby, and they will ruin anything up that they see as a threat to their cubs. I woke up my tent mate to tell him, and we just watched the cubs mess with the crew gear, waiting for them to leave the campsite. They eventually did, and nothing ended up happening, but my heart was pounding in my skull that whole time. I was walking around my land one night with my thermal scope. I looked at a berm of saw palmettos 50 feet from me and saw a massive deer-sized animal, maybe even larger, standing on top of the berm. I tried to get a better view as there was some brush in the way. It jumped down silently and disappeared, still no clue WTF it was. When I was a kid I found a small headless deer corpse that was sufficiently decayed there was no visible fur, but the rib cage and spine were only somewhat scattered by scavengers and it looked extremely human for a long moment. It was probably left by a hunter, but possibly a predator. FYI, human rib cages often collapse quickly in the decay process because they're held in place by soft tissue, while deer ribs have bonier joints, so a skeleton with an intact rib cage is probably a deer and not a human. About 10 years ago I was hiking with a few friends through the crazy mountain range in central Montana. We were 3 days into the trip and pretty deep into the range, so it's very remote. Late in the afternoon after a day of fly fishing, a naked dude came floating down the middle fork of Sweetgrass Creek all alone with just a small pontoon boat and no backpack or bags in sight, just him, his little pontoon and a paddle. He floats right by with a wave and floated down the stream alone. So many questions. How did he get there without shoes? Where are his clothes? Where is he going to spend the night? How will he stay warm when the temperature drops like 25 degrees after nightfall in a couple of hours? My dad, myself and my 2 brothers went camping next to a river on a farm owned by our neighbor. We spent the day fishing and swimming. The water level was a bit lower than normal so we caught a lot of fish. We went to sleep and woke up the next morning at 5 a.m. to the most disgusting smell. We crawled out of the tent and my dad shone his flashlight at the river. There, about 40 feet in front of us was a dead bloated horse, upside down, stuck on a rock. You can imagine the horror of this sight at 5 a.m. My poor dad had to swim up to the horse and spent what seems like an eternity pushing the horse off the rocks with a stick. Bonus stories: the first time we camped there with my dad, we first stopped at the store to buy a gazebo for some shade. We set it up and the moment we stepped back to admire our handiwork, a gust of wind lifts the thing and bends the frame. To say my dad was pissed is an understatement. We spent the rest of the weekend under this crooked structure and threw it away afterwards. During one camping trip, we pitched the 3-room tent. My youngest brother shared a room with my dad since he was still small in size. It was a nice tent, every room had its own door and zip. In the middle it had a lounge-type space. That night it started raining, and we had forgotten the canvas that stretches over the tent. Some water came in and made the lounge wet, but our rooms were fine. Halfway through the night my eldest brother's screams awaken us, "Help, help, I'm drowning." My dad peeks out of his room and says, "Then sit up." I laughed so hard my tummy ached. My brother woke up lying in a pool of water and immediately panicked, not realizing he can literally just sit up and be okay. Those were fun times, I miss it. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.